a long table on the porch, steaming with bread and stew, every chair filled but one. Hired men eat. The old neighbor laughs. The doctor wipes his beard. At the head sits a broad-shouldered rancher, his plate bare, staring at the empty dish before him. His new wife passes him by, ladle in hand, and serves the dog first. 3 months earlier, on a ship crossing gray water, an old Swedish woman pressed Anika's hands and said, "A man will eat whatever you set down, but a good man learns to ask. Feed no one who cannot say please, not even a husband. Hunger teaches what kindness cannot." Anika tucked the words away like a seed in dry soil. She did not yet know the man waiting in Nebraska. She knew only that respect, once given freely, is rarely returned. Gustav Lindqvist owned 400 acres of good Nebraska grass and not one soul to share it. He was 40, weathered as a fence post, and twice as quiet. His mother had died the winter before, and with her went the last voice in the house that ever softened him. He ate alone. He worked alone. He had forgotten, slowly and without noticing, how to speak to another person, as though they mattered. The ranch ran on his silence. 3 hired men, young Pell, steady Oscar, and the lame old hand called Brunn, took their orders in grunts and gestures. They respected his cattle sense and feared his temper, which was not loud but cold, a door shut without a word. Down the road lived the widow Halloran, who kept chickens and opinions in equal number, and who had told Gustav to his face that a man so unpleasant would die unburied. It was she who suggested the advertisement. "You cannot court," she said, "for you do not know how to be pleasant for the length of an evening. So buy yourself a wife from the catalogue, the way you buy a plow, and pray she is sturdier than you deserve." Gustav had written 3 lines. Rancher, sound health, good land. Wants a wife who can cook and keep house. No nonsense. He had not thought to mention kindness or laughter or what he might offer in return, because it had not occurred to him that a marriage was a thing offered to. The letter that answered came in a careful hand. Anika Bergstrom, 28, from a fishing town north of Gothenburg. She could cook, she wrote, better than most. She could read and figure. She had buried her parents and had no wish to be a burden to her brother's growing family. She asked only one question, which Gustav had skimmed past. "What is the thing you most wish to learn?" He had not answered it. He had sent passage money and a date. Now the date had come. The town of Pell's Crossing, named for young Pell's grandfather, though everyone forgot it, buzzed with the news that cold Gustav Lindqvist had ordered himself a bride. The banker, Hollis Pruitt, who held the note on half the ranches in the county, remarked dryly that he hoped she came with a return policy. The men at the feed store laughed. Gustav heard and said nothing, and went to meet the train. She stepped down onto the platform in a gray traveling dress, a single trunk behind her chin level and her eyes the pale blue of deep ice. She was taller than he expected, and not at all frightened, which unsettled him more than tears would have. Gustav looked at her for a long moment. He might have said her name. He might have asked after the voyage, or whether she was tired, or simply welcome. What, he said after the silence had stretched too long, was, "Wagon's there. I'll want supper by 6. Beef and potatoes. Don't keep me waiting." He turned and walked toward the wagon without offering his arm or taking the trunk. Anika stood a moment on the platform. Something settled in her, quiet and final like a key turning. She lifted her own trunk, followed him, and said nothing at all. The ranch house was clean enough and cold in spirit. Anika walked through it that first afternoon, learning its bones. The heavy stove, the dry larder, the pantry stocked by a man who bought only what kept. She found flour, salt, a side of beef hung in the cool cellar, onions, a sack of potatoes growing eyes. Enough, more than enough, for a woman who had fed a household on herring and patience. She could have made the supper. Beef and potatoes by 6 as ordered. It would have been the simplest thing in the world, and the whole shape of her life would have followed from it. A life of orders given and orders met, of a man who never once turned to look at the person who kept him fed and warm. She had seen that marriage. Her mother had lived it. She had watched a strong woman shrink year by year into someone who apologized for taking up a chair. She stood at the window and watched Gustav cross the yard to the barn, never glancing back at the house. He had not asked her name since the platform. He had not asked whether she could read his orders, whether she was hungry from 3 weeks of travel, whether the room he had given her suited her. He had set down his wants like a man dropping a load of wood and walked off. The old woman's words came back. Feed no one who cannot say please. Hunger teaches what kindness cannot. It was a dangerous thing she was considering. She had no money of her own, no friends in this country, no road home. A wife who defied her husband in 1887 Nebraska had little law and less sympathy on her side. He could turn her out. He could make her fly a misery of small cruelties. The widow had warned her, in a letter Annika had received before sailing, that Gustav was not wicked, but had simply never been taught that other people were real. And there it was, never been taught. Anika turned the phrase over. A thing untaught could be taught, not by argument. She had tried arguing with hard men and lost, not by tears. Tears only proved you could be moved and therefore managed. But hunger was honest. Hunger asked nothing of cleverness. A man who would not say please to a person might yet say it to his own empty stomach, and learn, through that small humbling, that the person and the stomach were served by the same two hands. She tied on an apron. She lit the stove. She began very deliberately to cook. By 6 o'clock, the kitchen smelled of roast beef, fresh bread, onions softened in butter, and an apple cake cooling on the sill. It smelled, the hired men would later swear, like a holiday. Gustav came in at 6 exactly, washed his hands, and sat at the head of the table. Anika carried the platters out to the porch where she had set a long table. She called the three hired men. She called, through the open gate, the widow Halloran, who happened to be passing. She set down beef and bread and cake before each of them, filled their cups, and bid them eat. Then she came inside, where Gustav sat at the empty table, and set before him a clean, bare plate, and nothing on it. It was the widow Halloran who became Anika's first true friend in that country. That night, on the porch, watching the strange supper unfold, the old woman laughed until she wheezed, then leaned close to the new bride and said, "Child, I have wanted to do that to him for 10 years and never had the nerve." Over the weeks that followed, she taught Anika the lay of the county, who owed money to the banker Pruitt, who could be trusted, which neighbor had a sick child. She gave Anika a wedge of the world to stand on, and she watched, delighted to see how the lesson would land. Gustav stared at the empty plate, then at the porch, where his own hired men were eating his own beef in the gold evening light. Then back at the plate. "Where is my supper?" he said. It was not a question. He did not know how to make it one. "On the porch," Anika answered in her careful accented English. "There is beef, bread, and cake. The men are eating. The widow is eating. You are welcome to look. I told you. 6 o'clock, beef and potatoes, and I made them. They are very good." She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him at the bare table, calm as a Sunday. "Everyone says so. Then put it on my plate." She looked at him. "When you ask me kindly, I will." The word landed in the room like a dropped pan. Gustav's face went still. He was not a stupid man, and he understood in some buried way exactly what was being asked of him. That was what made it intolerable. To say please to her now would be to admit there had been a please owed all along, on the platform, in the letter, in his mother's kitchen years ago. He stood up so fast the chair scraped. "I'll get my own," he said, and walked out to the porch where his men fell silent and looked at their boots, and the widow Halloran beamed at him like a cat at a saucer. He carried a plate back inside and ate it cold and alone, and it tasted of ash, though the same beef on the porch had tasted of heaven. So began the strangest season in the history of that ranch. Anika cooked. There was no fault to find in it. That was the genius of the thing. 3 meals a day appeared, ample and fine, better than the men had eaten in their lives. The hired hands, who had taken their grub in sullen silence for years, now lingered at a laid table with a cloth on it and a flower in a jar, and they began, slowly, then all at once, to soften like the onions. Young Pell took to whittling little toys for the widow's grandchildren. Oscar started shaving on weekdays. Brunn, the lame old hand, told stories at supper that no one had known he carried, of cattle drives and a wife long dead, and his rough voice would catch, and the table would go gentle around him. Only Gustav ate alone. Every meal, Anika set a place for him at the inside table, with a clean plate, a cup, a folded napkin, and nothing on the plate. The food was always 20 feet away on the porch. All he had to do was ask for it kindly. He would not. He was a proud man, and pride had been his only company for so long that he mistook it for himself. He fetched his own meals. He ate standing at the counter, or out at the barn, glowering. He told himself she would break first, that no woman could keep up such foolishness, that hunger and good sense would bring her round. But Anika was never hungry. She ate well at the porch table with the others, and she was never unkind. She mended his shirts, she kept his house spotless. She asked after his day in a pleasant voice, and listened to his short answers. She did everything a good wife did, save the one thing. She would not serve him food until he asked for it, like one human being asking another. Word got out. It always does in a small county. Within a week, the men at the feed store had a new joke, and it was on Gustav. Lindfist, they'd call. Your wife cooking for the whole township yet? Save me a plate, will you, since you can't get one yourself. The blacksmith laughed. The boys laughed. Even quiet men who feared Gustav's temper risked a grin behind his back. The cold rancher whose wife would feed every stranger on the road before she'd feed him. It was the funniest thing to happen in Pell's Crossing, since the mayor's hat blew into the trough. Gustav bore it the way he bore everything, stone-faced, jaw tight, saying nothing. But each laugh worked at him like water at a stone, and the visitors kept coming because the word had spread that the Lindquist place set the finest table in the county. A peddler stopped and was fed. A circuit preacher stopped and was fed and blessed the house and rode off marveling. The traveling doctor, old Doc Ferris, came through to set a neighbor's arm and stayed to supper, and Anika heaped his plate and refilled it twice, and the doctor said he'd never eaten finer this side of Chicago. Gustav watched the doctor eat his beef and ate his own cold by the barn, and said nothing. The thing about a lesson taught through patience is that it does its work whether or not the student admits he is learning. Gustav would not say please, but other changes crept in where pride was not standing guard. He found himself, without deciding to, fixing the loose board on the porch where Anika set the table, so the legs would not wobble. He found himself bringing in the heavy water buckets before she could lift them, setting them by the stove and walking off gruffly before she could say thank you. One cold morning he banked the kitchen fire high before dawn, so the room would be warm when she came down, and when she found it warm she said nothing, only looked at him a beat longer than usual across the bare plate. He noticed things now. He noticed that she sang very low when she thought no one was near. Old Swedish songs, sad and sweet, that filled the kitchen like the smell of bread. He noticed that she was kind to Brunn, drawing out the old man's stories, never rushing him. He noticed that the men no longer dreaded the house but came to it gladly, and that the ranch ran easier for it, the work lighter when the workers were not miserable. He noticed that she was, in fact, the finest thing that had ever come to his land, and that he could not so much as get her to butter his bread because of a single word he was too proud to say. It gnawed at him. He tried tricks. He tried sitting at the porch table among the men, thinking she could hardly skip him there. She served everyone around him and set an empty plate at his place, sweetly, and the men nearly choked, holding in their laughter. He tried buying food in town and eating it in front of her to prove he did not need her cooking. But it was poor stuff, dry crackers and tinned beef, and the smell of her roast drifting from the porch made it sawdust in his mouth. He tried staying away at supper, riding the fence line till dark, coming home to a cold kitchen, but she had always left him a clean plate at his place, empty, waiting, patient as a question. The widow Halloran took to coming by most evenings, ostensibly to bring eggs, truly to watch the show. She and Anika would sit at the end of the porch table with their coffee, two women at ease, and talk in low voices and laugh. Gustav, eating his cold supper in the doorway, caught fragments. He understood slowly that the widow had become his wife's true companion in a way he had not, that Anika had built a life on his own land, full of warmth and friendship and song, and had simply set him outside it, gently, with a clean plate and an open door. He could come in any time. That was the maddening part. The door was never locked. The price of admission was 4 letters and a softened voice. One Sunday, a thin, dust-colored man came up the road on a fine horse. Hollis Pruitt, the banker, who held the note on the Lindquist ranch, as he held the notes on half the county. He had not come about money, not directly. He had come, Gustav understood at once, to see the joke for himself, to look upon the proud rancher humbled by his own wife and carry the tale back to town, fattened with detail. Pruitt tipped his hat to Anika at the gate. "I've heard," he said smoothly, "that this is the place to eat in the whole county. I confess I came hungry." And Anika, who knew exactly who he was, for the widow had told her everything, smiled and said, "Then you have come to the right house. Sit, there is plenty." She fed the banker, she fed Hollis Pruitt, who held the power to ruin them, before she would feed her own husband, and she did it with such grace that Pruitt, who had come to mock, found himself disarmed, eating bread and praising it, asking after her recipes, lingering in the gold light like any other tired traveler glad of a kind table. And Gustav stood at the barn door watching the man who could foreclose on his life being served his supper, while he himself went hungry on his own land, and the shame of it was a live coal in his chest. But underneath the shame, for the first time, was something else. A question forming slowly that he could not yet say aloud. What kind of man have I been, that everyone is welcome at my table but me, and it is no one's fault but my own? He did not answer it, not yet. But the question had been let in, and a question, once inside, is very hard to evict. It came to a head on a Thursday. Gustav had been gentling a young horse all day, and had not eaten since dawn. He came in at dusk, dead tired, and the smell of the supper, pork roast, his favorite that she had made knowing it was his favorite, nearly drove him to his knees. He sat at the bare table. She set the clean, empty plate before him. He looked at the plate a long time. Then at her. The words were right there behind his teeth, and his whole proud life was on the other side of them. "Anika," he said, and his voice cracked on it. "Would you?" And then the pride seized him again, and he stood and went out and ate cold bread in the dark. But the great enemy in that country was never a man with a fist. It was the ledger, the note, the dry season, the bank. The drought came in July. The rains that should have greened the grass in June simply did not arrive. The creek that fed the lower pasture shrank to a string, then to a trickle, then to cracked mud. Day after day the sky stayed a hard, cloudless blue, beautiful and merciless. The grass yellowed. The cattle grew thin. Gustav rode out at dawn and came back at dark with a face like a closed fist, because a rancher reads the sky the way a sailor reads the sea, and the sky was telling him he might lose everything. Hollis Pruitt rode out again, and this time he came about money. He sat his fine horse at the gate and did not dismount. "Lindquist," he said, "the note, $200 due at the end of August. I'd hate to have to call it. But a man has to protect the bank's interests, especially in a dry year. If the cattle come in light at the fall sale, and I think they will, you won't make it. I'd be willing to take the lower pasture in lieu, the piece with the creek frontage. Sign it over now and we'll call the debt square." It was a robbery dressed as a kindness. The lower pasture, even dry, was the best land Gustav had, the piece that made the whole ranch worth holding. Without it, the place was a husk. Pruitt knew it. He had wanted that creek frontage for years, to control the water for every ranch downstream, and the drought had handed him his chance. Gustav knew it too. He stood at the gate with his hands curled and his jaw working, and for once his cold silence failed him entirely. He had no answer. He had no money. He had no reign. He had spent his life being hard and self-sufficient, asking nothing of anyone, and now, in his hour of need, he found he had built no friendships to draw on, no goodwill in the bank of the county, nothing but 400 acres going to dust and a note he could not pay. "I'll think on it," he said at last, hating the smallness of his own voice. "Think quick," said Pruitt, and turned his fine horse and rode away. That night Gustav sat at the bare table and put his head in his hands. Anika came and stood near. She did not gloat. The game between them had gone too deep for gloating. She had come to understand the man she was teaching, and she did not enjoy his suffering. She set down a cup of coffee at his place. Coffee, not food, but it was the first thing she had set before him in weeks, and the small mercy of it nearly undid him. "The banker," she said. "He wants the lower pasture. He'll have it, or he'll have the whole place." Gustav's voice was flat. "There's no rain. The cattle sell light. I can't make the note." He laughed, a dry, terrible sound. "And there's not a soul in this county who'd lift a finger to help me. I made sure of that. Years of it. Every man at the feed store would pay good money to watch Pruitt take my land." Anika was quiet a moment. Then she said, "You are wrong, but you will not believe me yet." She was thinking of the porch, of the months of suppers, of every hired man and neighbor and traveler who had eaten at her table and gone away warmed, and of the goodwill she had been quietly banking, meal by meal, in the only currency that mattered in a hard country. Kindness given, kindness remembered. She had been feeding the whole county, and a county that has been fed does not forget. But Gustav could not see it. He saw only his own coldness reflected back at him and assumed the world was as cold as he had been. He drank his coffee and went up to bed and lay awake listening to the dry wind, certain he had lost. August came in hotter and drier than July. The creek failed entirely. The cattle had to be driven to the far north pasture where a single windmill still drew water, and Gustav and the men worked from dark to dark hauling and watching and praying, and still the steers grew lean, and still no cloud crossed the iron sky. The fall sale would be a disaster. Everyone knew it. Pruitt knew it best of all, and he began to circle, riding out twice a week now, always pleasant, always patient, always with the deed to the lower pasture folded in his coat. He had stopped pretending it was about the note. It was about the water, and through the water, about owning the whole valley. And then Pruitt made his mistake, the kind of mistake proud, grasping men always make. He grew too sure of himself, and he overreached. He had been so confident of taking the Lindquist water that he had already, quietly, called in the smaller notes of the ranchers downstream. The Mercers, old Brunn's married daughter, the widow Halloran herself, meaning to bundle the whole valley under his control while the drought had everyone by the throat. He sent his letters out all in the same week, cold and identical, demanding payment or signature, certain that desperate people would have no choice but to sign. He had forgotten one thing. He had forgotten that desperate people, when they are frightened and alone, will sign anything. But desperate people who know they are not alone will fight. And the people of that valley were not alone. They had a place they had all been gathering, all summer, almost without noticing, a long porch with a laid table, where a Swedish woman fed anyone who came and asked nothing in return. They had sat at that table together. They had eaten the same bread. The widow had brought her grandchildren. The Mercers had brought their troubles. Doc Ferris had brought the news of the county. Around Anika's table, slowly, all summer, a scattered and suspicious people had become something they had not been in years. Neighbors. A community. A single body that could feel a threat to any part of it. So when Pruitt's letters landed, the valley did not scatter. It gathered. It gathered on the Lindquist porch on a hot August evening, drawn there as naturally as water runs downhill, because it had become the place where people came when they did not know what else to do. Anika fed them all. Of course she did. She put on a great pot of stew. and baked until the kitchen was an oven. And she fed the Mercers and the widow and Brunn's daughter and her husband and a dozen others, and as they ate, they talked. And as they talked, they discovered they had all received the same letter. They discovered that Pruitt was not squeezing one of them, but all of them. They discovered that the thing they had each faced alone in dread was a single thing, and could be faced together. Doc Ferris, who had a head for figures and a long memory, said the words that changed everything. He can't foreclose on all of us at once, the doctor said slowly. Not in one season. The bank hasn't the cash to carry that many properties through a dry year, and his backers in Omaha won't stand for it if it looks like he's run the whole valley into the ground for his own gain. It'd ruin his name. All he's got is the bluff. That we'll each cave alone before we figure out we're standing together. A murmur went around the porch like wind through wheat, and Gustav, standing in the doorway as he always stood, outside the warmth as he had made himself outside everything, Gustav heard it. He heard his neighbors, the very men he'd sworn would pay to see him ruined, sitting at his wife's table and planning, without being asked, to stand with him, because she had fed them, because she had built, on his cold land and out of his owned beef, a thing he had never in his life thought to build, a reason for people to care whether he survived. He looked at Anika moving among them with her ladle, and his throat closed, and he understood at last the size of what she had done. But understanding came a breath too late. The next morning Pruitt rode out early, before the valley's new courage could harden into a plan. He came with a county clerk and a paper with a seal, and he was smiling. "I've moved the date," he told Gustav at the gate, in front of the watching men. "Notes due Friday, not the end of the month. There's a clause. You signed it 3 years ago and never read it. I'd wager you never read anything I put in front of you. Friday, Lindquist, $200, or the deed, the whole deed, not just the pasture now, the house, the land, all of it." He let the paper flutter. "Your neighbors can't save you in 3 days. No one can." He rode off. Gustav walked out to the dry creek bed and sat on a stone in the heat, looked at nothing. Friday, 3 days, $200 he did not have and could not raise, not with the cattle still on the range and weeks from sale. Not with every neighbor as cash poor as he was. The community Anika had built could not be turned into $200 by Friday. Goodwill did not pay a note. He had been a fool to hope, and worse than the losing, far worse, was the knowing. He saw it all now with terrible clarity, the way a man sees his whole road only when he has walked off the end of it. He had been given by some grace he had not earned, the finest woman in the territory. She had come across an ocean to a cold man, and instead of shrinking as his coldness deserved, she had quietly, patiently, lovingly tried to teach him how to be worth loving. And he had stood in the doorway all summer, too proud to walk 8 steps to a laid table and say one soft word. He had wasted it. He had wasted her, and the months, and the chance, and now the land would go, and the strange, tender household she'd built would scatter, and she would have crossed the whole world for nothing but a hard man and a lost ranch. He put his face in his hands. For the first time since he was a boy, Gustav Lindqvist wept. He did not know how long he sat, but when he stood, something in him had broken clean through. The way drought-hard ground, when the rain finally comes, does not soak it slowly but cracks open all at once. He walked back to the house. The supper was laid on the porch. The men were gathering. The smell of bread was on the evening air. Anika came out with a platter, saw his face, and went still. Gustav walked past the porch and into the kitchen to the inside table where the clean, empty plate had waited for him all summer. He stood behind his chair, and he waited for her to come. She came. She set down her platter on the porch, said a quiet word to the widow, and came inside, wiping her hands on her apron, her pale eyes steady on his face. Gustav stood behind his chair with his hat in his hands like a boy at church. The proud line of his shoulders was gone. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough and unsteady, and every man and woman on the porch fell silent to hear it through the open door. "Anika," he said, I have been a cold and stupid man. You came across the whole world to me, and I gave you orders instead of a welcome. I have eaten alone all summer because I was too proud to say one word, and the word was please. He swallowed. I see now what you were teaching me. I see what you built on my land that I never had the sense to build myself. These people on my porch, they're here because of you. The only good thing that ever happened to this place is you. He pulled out her chair, not his own, hers, and held it. Please, he said. Will you sit and eat your supper with me? And will you forgive a fool who's only just learned how to ask? The kitchen was very quiet. Out on the porch, the widow Halloran had pressed both hands to her mouth and was weeping openly and not bothering to hide it. Anika looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the floor, and she did not sit in the chair he held. Instead, she took the empty plate from his place, the plate she had set before him bare every day for 2 months, and she carried it out to the porch, and she filled it high with pork roast and bread and beans and good things. And she carried it back, and she set it down at his place. And then she sat in the chair he held for her. Eat, she said softly. You have learned the lesson. Now eat, husband, and let us be done with hunger. And Gustav ate his wife's cooking for the first time, at his own table, with her beside him, and the men on the porch raised a cheer that startled the horses in the barn. But the night was not done. For the widow Halloran wiped her eyes and stood and clapped her hands and said, Well, that's the wedding we should have had now. About Friday. And she looked round the porch at all the fed and gathered faces. Pruitt wants $200 by Friday. He thinks we're each too poor and too scared to find it. He thinks we'll let him take this place, and then the next, and the next, till he owns the water and the whole valley with it. Doc Ferris stood. He's overplayed his hand. I've been thinking on it all night. He's called in too many notes at once. If we stand together, if not one of us signs his paper, he can't carry it. But Gustav's note comes due first, and if Pruitt takes this place, he'll have his win and his example, and the rest of us will lose our nerve. So, the doctor looked around. We don't let him take the first one. We pay Gustav's note together, tonight. And then a thing happened that Gustav Lindqvist would remember to the last day of his long life. Old Brunn stood up first, the lame hand who'd worked the ranch for years, and laid down his wages, every dollar he'd saved. $40, he said gruffly. I got no family but this table. The Mercers put in 30. The widow put in 50 from her egg money and her late husband's watch besides. Brunn's daughter and her husband put in 20. Young Pell and Oscar emptied their pockets. Doc Ferris put in 40 and said he'd never had a patient pay better than a free supper all summer. A peddler who happened to be passing, the same one Anika had fed weeks before, heard the talk at the gate, climbed down and put in $5, saying a kindness was owed, and here was the chance to pay it. They counted it out on the porch table by lamplight. $212. 12 over. Gustav stood in the middle of it, turning slowly, looking at the faces of the people he had been so sure would cheer his ruin, and who had instead emptied their pockets to save him, because his wife had fed them all summer and asked nothing, and a fed and grateful people do not forget. I can't take this, he said hoarsely. I've not earned it. I've been nothing but cold to every one of you. You haven't earned it, the widow agreed cheerfully, but she has. And you had the sense to marry her, which is the one wise thing you've ever done. Take the money. Pay it back at harvest when you can. That's what neighbors are for, you stubborn ox. And it's a thing you'd have known years ago if you'd ever come to the table. On Friday, Gustav rode into Pell's Crossing with $200 in his coat, and the whole valley riding behind him. Not because he had asked, but because they had decided, all on their own, to see it done. He laid the money on Hollis Pruitt's desk and asked for his note marked paid, and the clerk witnessed it, and there was nothing the banker could do but take the cash and hand over the paper, his smooth face gone sour. And when Pruitt looked up to find half the valley filling his office, every one of them holding his unsigned letter, every one of them refusing his deed, He understood that his bluff was called and his game was finished. Word of how he'd tried to squeeze the whole valley in a dry year reached his backers in Omaha within the month, and they did not like how it looked. And Hollis Pruitt found his own position a good deal less comfortable than he'd planned. He sold out and moved on by spring. The valley kept its water. The rain came the second week of August. 3 days of it, soft and steady, and the grass came back green, and the cattle fattened, and the fall sale was no disaster after all. Gustav paid back every dollar at harvest, with a sack of the season's best potatoes thrown in for each household, delivered by hand with thanks said plainly to every face. A long table on the porch, steaming with bread and stew, every chair filled, and one more chair added at the head, where the broad-shouldered rancher sits with a full plate before him and his wife at his side. The hired men eat. The old neighbor laughs. The grandchildren chase the dog through the yard, and before he lifts his fork, Gustav Lindqvist stands and lifts his cup and looks down the table at the woman who crossed an ocean to teach him the one word no one else had dared. To my wife, he says, and his voice does not crack now, only warms, who fed everyone except me until I learned to ask. Please, he says, smiling at her, pass the bread. And she does.